The financial discussion are always very, very difficult during these conferences of the parties. First, there's a broader point, I'll come back to that, on what you call policy coherence and alignment of financial flows, making sure that all resources are being mobilized in favor of biodiversity and not against biodiversity. Then there's a more practical question of how much funding will be committed. There's been some amount mentioned, but there's a lot of different negotiations about that. A lot of the negotiations will focus on how binding the commitment to deliver a certain amount of funding will be. And there's a lot of different texts that can be proposed that then vary between parties really making a firm binding commitment and actually something exceptionally vague. A very important question is whether the commitment, so the funding, will come from public sources, so the governments themselves who actually signed to the agreement, or whether they put actually something into the agreement that says, well, there will be a lot of money, but most of it will be paid by others, that is the private sector. And there's, of course, especially a lot of the donor countries are very much inclined to say, yeah, there will be a lot of money, but it's companies that will give that money, not us. Then, if, of course, a lot of the funding comes from the private sector, that will come with a privatization also of biodiversity, because if a sector gives a lot of funding to something, it also buys a lot of influence on the governance. So you're really talking about not just a privatization of biodiversity finance, but also of biodiversity governance. I'll go deeper in that in this brief presentation as well. There's a thorny issue of who will decide where the money goes. Will that be the parties to the Convention on Biodiversity itself, or will that be the financial mechanism of the convention? And the financial mechanism of the convention is the Global Environment Facility, GEF. That has a council, and the little difference between the parties and the GEF is that the United States is part of the GEF, and it's actually host of the main secretariat of the GEF, which is the World Bank, which is based in Washington. And so it has quite a lot of influence, while, of course, the Council of the Parties only has the US as a non-party state there, but not as a voting party. So that kind of dynamics will play down in a lot of difficult negotiations of how much influence the parties have vis-a-vis the Global Environment Facility itself. Then there's a proposal for a new global biodiversity fund, basically also by those parties that are frustrated with the Global Environment Facility being dominated very much by, for example, the World Bank. Of course, there's a broader question very much related to women's groups, is whether women and other rights holders will be able to participate in the decision-making related to resource mobilization. There are some proposals in the text for that. And then, of course, there's a question whether some of all that funding that is supposed to be mobilized will actually reach women's groups and other rights holders, and how that will be done, and whether it will be just a little bit or whether it will be significant. The basis of all of that is that if there's no agreement on any of these issues, or one of these issues, there will be not agreement at all at COP. And there's still a big risk that the whole COP will actually fail. So this is a really important issue. Very briefly, I think it's important to put all of this in the broader context and really re-emphasize that women are very dependent on biodiversity, but also economically and politically marginalized overall. They earn a lot less, so have a lot of discrimination in the financial field. So in general, they have a lot less monetary wealth. But because of that lack of monetary wealth, they're disproportionately dependent on the non-monetary wealth of biodiversity can deliver. So free access to biodiversity, to natural resources. So that is why it is actually really important to make sure that women and other rights holders that are disproportionately dependent on biodiversity itself and not so much on monetary economies have a very strong say in biodiversity governance, and that it's not privatized for them. Now, the sad thing, if you talk about, delivering funding for biodiversity, is that there's actually far more money going at this moment to activities that are harmful to biodiversity than there's going to activities that contribute to biodiversity conservation. And I've tried to put it, although this is not exactly correct, but a little bit in a picture. The big red arrow that goes to one side is a 3.1 trillion US dollar approximately per year that is harmful financial, qualified as harmful financial flows. That's a lot of investments and also some subsidies, some $500 billion of subsidies, direct public support by governments for biodiversity destruction. And then there's a tiny little arrow that you might hardly see, which is in green, which is just 85 billion, about 1/30 of that money is actually going to biodiversity conservation. I think it is clear from here that it is essential to first and foremost stop financing biodiversity destruction. If you don't do that, trying to fund biodiversity conservation is like pouring a bucket of water on a lava stream that's coming from a exploding volcano. And I can tell you that's actually even quite dangerous to do that. Don't try it out. But it just doesn't help a lot. You really need to stop, this whole negative financial flow to biodiversity destruction. And that is summarized by both a Global Biodiversity Forum framework draft target, but also in the resource mobilization text decisions that will be proposed to the Conference of the Parties. There's a very good amount of emphasis on the need to align, as they say, all financial flows with biodiversity objectives. And I think this is actually one of the most important achievements this Conference of the Parties can have. And maybe we can even be a little bit hopeful here that if there is indeed disagreement, we could at least make a first step to, halting this tremendous flow of negative, harmful financial flows going to biodiversity destruction. Reminding banks, reminding international financial institutions all the time that they should not finance activities that harm biodiversity. However, we've done a research at Global Forest Coalition about why, especially subsidies, which is public money, is still so much invested in biodiversity destruction. And we did it in 9 different countries and the European Union. And the conclusion in summary was that there's too much corporate influence on policymaking. And those corporations benefit from the subsidies. So reducing those subsidies is just not in their interest, and that's why they will halt it and block it everywhere they can. And you see that in a lot of different countries. Meanwhile, and Vivienne, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a very, speaking example from Costa Rica, which actually had quite a success between 1960 and 2005 in reducing its deforestation rate. And if you then, and the fascinating thing, and I'm mentioning this because I know that now Brazil is, for example, very much promoting payments from environmental services. And even the Costa Rican government very often still says that payments for environmental services were their big success story. Paying for conservation of biodiversity, that this financial flow, this conservation money is very important. However, if you see the deforestation rate, the payment for environmental services system, PSA in Spanish, was actually introduced in 1997 only, when the deforestation was almost close to zero. And forests had actually started to regrow already. What was the real success in Costa Rica is the removal of perverse incentives, and especially reducing beef production. So the solution to a lot of this is often on our plates. And then there's the risk that if you really focus on more and more funding for biodiversity, especially if you don't reduce those harmful flows, that you also end up with false financial flows. More capital, by definition, means more capitalism. We have to ask ourselves the question, so where's this money going to come from? It's easy to talk about 700 billion, as if that money would fall from the sky, but that money has to be earned. And sadly, it's very much earned for more extractivism, more overproduction, more consumerism, and, for example, more mass or elite tourism. And capitalism inherently cannot respect planetary boundaries because it's an economic strategy that's based on continued growth. You cannot, halt capitalism, and just say that it cannot grow anymore. It has to grow because of the whole returns of investments it has to deliver. And that clashes with planetary boundaries. By definition, if we really want to stick within planetary boundaries, we need to change this heart of the system, and that is, this unlimited growth that is pretended. Another big false financial flow is carbon and biodiversity offsets. They've become actually one of the biggest sources at the moment, especially forest carbon offsets, of private biodiversity finance. It's a hugely booming market, and they're completely driven by corporate interest into greenwashing. And the hopeless thing is that because, and this is a long story, being summarized, please ask me more questions, but I don't want to take too much time. But because it's very much driven by this very clear target of having to conserve a certain amount of forest or other ecosystem, it tends to overlook the rights and interests of women and other rights holders on the ground. And this is inherent dynamics of both carbon and biodiversity offsets. And these are now both promoted under this term nature-based solutions. Now, nature-based solutions are basically solutions using nature for business. That's what a nature-based solution is. And as they're meant for solutions for business, they will need to be profitable. And while formally and also practically, nature-based solutions can include the good, the bad, and the evil, it's often the most evil projects that are the most profitable. And that's one of the big dangers, and that's why we call it a wolf in sheep's clothes. I'm happy to explain more about this, but I don't want to take too much time. I think underlying this whole trend is actually the bigger problem of the corporate capture of national, international biodiversity policy making. And especially this proposal to just blend private finance with public finance, with these donors saying, oh, the money will come, from the private sector, is exceptionally dangerous. And it's maybe the biggest, also, and there are public institutions on private sector finance means that that the public governance is undermined because they become dependent on the financial interests of these private sector funders. And that includes, for example, that interest in subsidies. So that's why we can't get rid of harmful subsidies. And then there's the whole corporate capture of parallel discussions about finance, for example, the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which is to the detriment of the rights holders like women. And if you want to know more about this, there's an excellent blog on our website, and soon we'll also publish a video about why there's so much problems with this task force on nature-related financial disclosures. But I mean, the biggest problem is that this is really a debate that's totally captured by the private sector, which has this big interest basically in making money out of harmful activities at the source. So in general, resource mobilization makes very little sense without transformative change, including global tax and debt justice. Here again, trying to summarize a very big, broad analysis in short, and this graph is actually from a paper by Jessica Dempsey and al., which you can download very easily from the web in 2022 about global tax and debt justice. But I mean, you have to ask the question also, why is so little money, public money by governments invested in biodiversity conservation? Why is this not more central? And one of the big problems a lot of southern countries actually also face is that a disproportionate amount of their money has to go to debt servicing, with debt being very much part of a very big inherent package of neocolonial financial, dominance, imperialism. And on the other hand, there's this huge problem that for a lot of governments, it's very difficult to collect all the taxes they are supposed to collect. There's too much tax evasion. And that is also another very complicated problem, but it has to be addressed if you want to make sure that the governments themselves can invest sufficient budget in at least the institutions that are responsible for biodiversity conservation, etc. So if we don't see this broader picture, we're also just throwing, basically water on the lava stream. So last but not least, I think it's really important to keep in mind with all of this discussion about resource mobilization that forests and other ecosystems were perfectly capable of managing themselves for millions of years without any money even having been invented. I mean, they were there before money was invented. So this whole claim that we cannot conserve biodiversity without funding is interesting from a political perspective and from an equity perspective insofar, there's the whole discussion about common but differentiated responsibilities and the North having to contribute to the capacity of the South to conserve biodiversity. But in the end, biodiversity just grows as long as we don't destroy it. What we do need, and we need to put very central, is effective, equitable, and gender-just governance of biodiversity to halt destruction, especially, community conserved areas, indigenous territories being rejected. And that means that I think one of the essential things we should fight for, even more than funding going to women's organization, is our participation in this broader discussion about biodiversity finance. And there's clauses about that also in COP15, in the texts that are being proposed. And I think we should fight really hard to make sure that women and other rights holders, are getting their place on the table on all these different bodies that discuss, resource mobilization on biodiversity in general. I'll keep it at this. There's a lot more to say, but I don't want to take too much time. Feel free to ask though.
Thank you so much, Simone, for this really insightful presentation. There are many, many topics to discuss, as you're saying. And for all of our members, please feel free to reach Simone via the chat or during the breakout rooms. If you have any further question, any other comment, concern, advice that you would like to seek from her, please reach out to her. And now we're moving into the second point, that is monitoring and reporting. And we're going to have Catherine Despotes-Belmonte from the World Conservation Monitoring Center. Please, Catherine, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amelia. It's going to be really hard to follow Simone's presentation, which was honestly so amazing and interesting. The topic that I'm going to be discussing is a little bit drier, but important as well. Can you see my screen? Is it everything looking okay?
Yes, everything's fine.
Great. So just to summarize the key ways that we've tried to integrate gender considerations in planning, monitoring, and reporting throughout the process of the development of the post-2020, some of the key entry points were, in terms of planning, the focus on national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Also, specific suggestions on how gender and women should be considered in national reports. And because there's an element of monitoring, we've also provided some suggestions on indicators, gender-sensitive indicators to be included in the monitoring framework. One of the latest suggestions was that the monitoring framework should also include an overarching principle on data disaggregation, including sex disaggregation for those indicators that relate to people. So now I'm just going to update you on the process, on how some of these suggestions have been reflected in the final documents and the things that are still missing, so that we can discuss further in the discussion section of this meeting. How do I change? Seems that I can't change slides. No. Oh yeah, sorry. How strange. Okay, so in terms of planning, well, planning, monitoring and reporting as well as review mechanisms, and we won't have time to discuss review mechanisms during this call. All of the key recommendations from the subsidiary body on implementation have been made available in this document, CBD SBI/REC/311, is the options to enhance planning, reporting, and review mechanisms for strengthening the implementation of the convention. And I think a key achievement was the proposed SBI recommendation that encourages parties to apply the adopted post-2020 gender plan of action in all aspects and at all scales of planning, implementation, reporting, and review related to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. This is really important. This recommendation is very important because before the process of SBI and the meeting in Geneva earlier in this year, it was very unclear the linkages between the guidance document of the post-2020 gender plan of action and how it relates to specific mechanisms and processes for the implementation of the post-2020. So with this recommendation, basically, parties will need to take into account some specific actions that are provided in the gender plan of action that relates to planning, monitoring, and reporting, and hopefully ensure that those actions are taken into account in the processes of planning and reporting and monitoring. Okay. Also in this document, so this document is divided in sections. There's a section that focuses on planning, monitoring, and reporting and review. So we're just going to focus on planning and on the planning and reporting sections of the document. So in the planning section, it refers back to an addendum to this document that further provides guidance on revising and updating the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, the NBSAPs. And in this section, it also encourages all parties to use the headline indicators. You know, and it makes the suggestion that they can also use all their indicators that are being called component and complementary indicators. Later on during my presentation, we'll have a look at the monitoring framework and explore what the different indicators mean. So if you look back at the Annex A, and for those of you that joined this specific section of the session to dig deeper into this document, we'll have a look at Addendum 4. Which only makes one reference to women or gender considerations, and that it's to include women's groups in the process of updating national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So there are bits that are missing in terms of women and gender considerations related to planning. As I highlighted already, there's only one reference to women and gender considerations. Also, there isn't a proposed structure for developing NBSAP. So it's unclear how women are going to, women and gender experts are going to be involved in the process of reviewing, updating NBSAPs. How the contributions are going to be then reflected in national reports. There's information that is lacking, but we'll have a discussion later on this specific point. In terms of reporting, again, the document refers back to another annex. The annex is on Addendum 1, Amendment 1, that basically provides further information on how parties would report on progress to the different goals and targets to be agreed. Also, and this is mostly in brackets, again, it mentions that it seems that some parties would prefer that all make use of headline indicators to report on progress in their national reports as well as their NBSAPs. But this hasn't been agreed yet because making use of standardized headline indicators will have resourcing implications for developing nations. So many developing countries are just highlighting that, okay, we'll make use of headline indicators, but who is going to help us to develop our capacities and who is going to pay for this? You know, that's a key issue that Simone has already highlighted, that also relates to planning, reporting, and monitoring processes. So when we have a look at the addendum that focuses on reporting, it provides information on the process of reporting on the 7th and the 8th national reports, which will be the only 2 national reports to be provided until 2030. And there's one reference to women, which is in section 2 of this document in the draft template for national reports, that refers to the process of developing their national reports and ensuring consultation with a number of groups, including women's groups. And below, you can see this on the right-hand side. You can see the proposed structure for the submission of 7 and 8 national reports. And basically, what countries are being requested is that they provide in section 1 an executive summary. Then they need to provide a brief overview of the process for the preparation of the report. And I suppose section 2 could be a good entry point for ensuring that women's groups and gender experts are part of the process. And section 3 asks about updates on the development of MBSAPs. And section 4 focuses on the goals. Section 5 on the targets. And that's why it's so important to continue the advocacy on target 22, because a lot of focus will be on the targets and the resourcing implications for the implementation of these targets. And then in an annex to the report, then potentially parties will be able to report or share all the relevant information, including potentially the progress on the implementation on the gender plan of action. So what is still missing? There's still missing more references on women or gender considerations in the reporting section. Section 3 of the report, as I noted, it relates to MBSAPs, but there isn't any guidance or any reflection on how gender considerations have been considered in the development of the MBSAPs. And there needs to be better linkages with the gender plan of action in the annex section, because at the moment it's not complete at this moment. So potentially this is one of the things that we're going to discuss shortly. Lastly, in terms of the monitoring framework that is being proposed to follow progress on goals and targets to be agreed, there's a document from SABSTA with recommendations that has been made available for discussion at the COP. Some of you may be aware already, but basically there are 3 types of indicators that are being proposed. The headline indicators, that would be the standard indicators for goals and targets that all countries would need to use potentially in their MBSAPs as well as their national reports. This again needs to be agreed, but there's a strong push for this because it would be easier to follow process globally on the achievement of all targets and goals. There are other indicators that are being called component indicators that would provide further information on specific elements of a target or a goal. And then there's this third group of complementary indicators that as the name suggests, they will complement, provide further information. And unfortunately, on the monitoring framework, many key indicators at the moment are located in the complementary section, even though they are very important for issues that relate to women, like access to decision-making processes and access to land and resources. So at this stage, in terms of references to women in gender considerations in the monitoring framework, there's one reference in Annex 2. Annex 2 is the terms of reference for an ad hoc technical expert group on indicators that is being proposed, because the monitoring framework is far from being finalized. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of discussion on what is available there, if it's realistic for countries to use these indicators, questions about capacity, questions about alignment with the SDG framework and the implications and the cost implications that this would have for countries. So basically, this proposal for having an expert group is to support parties until COP16 to finalize the monitoring framework with robust indicators that are realistic and countries would be able to use to monitor progress towards the targets and the goals. So in this section of the report, there's mention of that this group should also invite other experts, including women's groups, which is great. Then on headline indicator 2101, there's a reference to women. There are 4 complementary indicators that relate to women and gender considerations. And Appendix 2, which is further indicators that have been proposed at a meeting that was carried out in Bonn following the SABSTA 24. So in this appendix, there's a compilation of extra indicators that were proposed at the Bonn meeting. Some of the key outcomes of the Bonn meeting on the indicators are reflected on the right-hand side of your screen. So there were proposals for indicators that include women and girls. This relates to the equitable participation in decision-making processes. There was also a suggestion for SDG indicator 142 that focuses on the total adult population that has secured tenure rights. This SDG indicator is meant to be disaggregated by sex and also type of tenure, and also it has a population element to potentially identify IPLCs or other groups that also have access to land tenure. So it seems that was a proposal that was made for a headline indicator that could be useful for target 21 and target 22. However, there wasn't discussion in the Bonn meeting about target 22 because it seems that the preparations for this meeting followed the first draft of the post-2020 framework, and as such, target 22 wasn't reflected. So what is missing from the monitoring framework is target 22. It's still missing a headline indicator for target 22. Also, that proposal that we made on an overarching principle on data disaggregation, including sex disaggregation, is missing. And this is very important because as I mentioned already, the priority is being given to headline indicators. And you'll have a look at the monitoring framework, and there are many, many indicators that it's impossible that countries will make use of all of them. So it's more likely that they're going to give priority to headline indicators, which means that if there's an agreed target 22, there'll be one indicator that will help to monitor progress towards that target, which is unlikely to cover all elements that are of importance to women and gender considerations. So what this overarching principle would suggest is that for all of those indicators that relate to people, if at all possible, to be disaggregated by sex so that it's easier to analyze women's considerations. So hopefully this should be one of the things that we ask for at the CBD in the next process of the negotiation. And also, as I mentioned already, there are many gender-sensitive indicators that are located in the component section, and it'd be useful to move them to either as component indicators or headline indicators, because it's very unlikely that countries will use them all. But we can discuss further shortly in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Now we're gonna proceed with Vivian Solis from Costa Rica, and she's gonna explain to us more about the coastal and marine biodiversity. Vemos tu pantalla, pero no te escuchamos.
¿Ahora sí? Ahora sí escuchan y se oye, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Bueno, muchas gracias por esta reunión, este espacio para compartir aprendizaje y conocimiento. Muchas gracias a Simón y a Catherine por esas explicaciones tan importantes que nos hacen sentirnos más cerca de una discusión global. Y gracias a Ame por el esfuerzo de organizar esta reunión. Bueno, se me ha solicitado hablar un poco sobre el tema marino y costero en la Convención de Diversidad Biológica. Yo quisiera decirles que este es uno de los 7 programas temáticos de la Convención de Diversidad Biológica y que a veces nos hemos concentrado mucho en los temas que tienen que ver con la redacción de en este caso, el marco global de biodiversidad, pero que hay una serie de acciones que desarrolla la Convención de Diversidad Biológica que es importante también que nosotros, como parte de este grupo de mujeres, tengamos información y conozcamos. Entonces, este programa, este 7º programa temático de la Convención, tiene en realidad 4 o 5 elementos que son fundamentales para las mujeres y las niñas del planeta. El primero tiene que ver con la iniciativa de océanos sostenibles. Este es un esfuerzo que la Secretaría de la Convención ha desarrollado con apoyo de algunos países como Corea, por ejemplo, para fortalecer las capacidades que tienen las partes y los observadores en función de ese programa temático sobre los océanos. Esto es muy importante porque periódicamente ellos llevan capacitaciones que tienen que ver con cómo ir cumpliendo los objetivos de la Convención en este tema. Entonces, este elemento es importante porque al tener nosotros cambios estructurales e importantes en materia del marco global de biodiversidad, en el monitoreo, en el financiamiento, esto debería de irse reflejando en cómo nuestros países y los diferentes actores tienen información sobre lo que está pasando a través de estas capacitaciones. El otro elemento importante son las áreas marinas de importancia ecológica y biológica, lo que se llama las EPSAs. Este es un acuerdo tomado por las partes hace ya bastantes años que llama a que las partes definan estas áreas marinas de importancia ecológica y biológica y donde hemos estado tratando desde hace muchos años también de incorporar elementos sociales y culturales, entre ellos una visión que respete el conocimiento tradicional de hombres y mujeres, de pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales. Estas EPSAs han sido reconocidas en diferentes partes del mundo y muy seguidamente pasan rápidamente a ser áreas marinas protegidas. Es decir, uno de los riesgos que hemos percibido desde las organizaciones que estamos trabajando el tema de conservación de la biodiversidad y derechos humanos es cómo después de estos rápidos nombramientos por parte del CDB, los estados pueden crear restricciones a usos consuetudinarios de estos recursos. El siguiente elemento importante tiene que ver con otras medidas de conservación basadas en áreas. Este concepto de OSMs en inglés o OMEX en español, y aquí entramos en este problema de las siglas, ¿verdad? Que hacen que muchas veces nos sintamos fuera de poder conversar siquiera los temas de la convención. Aparece cuando se aprueban las renombradas metas de Aichi, donde se dice que podríamos hacer conservación del mar y de la tierra a través de áreas protegidas, pero también de otras medidas de conservación basadas en área. ¿Qué es eso? ¿Qué significa? ¿Qué implicaciones tiene para las comunidades, para las mujeres, para los pueblos indígenas? Es el tema, digamos, de interés de nuestro trabajo aquí. Y además, la convención trata otros temas que son de muchísimo interés recientemente, como el tema de la contaminación, por ejemplo, de las aguas, el tema de las áreas marinas protegidas y demás. Entonces, este programa de la biodiversidad marino-costera tiene varias patitas, digamos, y hemos ido centrándonos cada vez más en reducirlo a dos temas importantes que han sido los que se han discutido en este proceso que nos enrumba hacia el marco global de biodiversidad. Es decir, se han desarrollado una serie de reuniones virtuales, formales, otras no formales, donde se han tomado acuerdos o no acuerdos. Por ejemplo, en este momento se está realizando una reunión virtual sobre los EPSAs, que está participando por parte del grupo de mujeres una compañera excelente, Ramia, que nos representa ahora en esta reunión virtual y que ha estado trabajando muy fuerte. Se ha realizado otra reunión de este tipo para los temas que tienen que ver con el documento marino costero, que es uno de los ítems 6 de la convención. Entonces, hemos ido reduciendo la discusión de lo marino a las EPSAs, a un documento que es un texto que tiene varios anexos y que pretende poder brindarle a las partes, a los países, la posibilidad de revisar los límites de estas áreas marinas, digamos, que han sido creadas sin elementos o indicadores sociales todavía. Y un documento sobre el tema marino costero que vuelve a englobar estas dudas que tenemos de cómo poder hacer conservación en función de los derechos humanos. Y por eso es que cuando hablamos de lo marino costero, el marco global de biodiversidad que se está preparando se hace fundamental, porque no podemos desligar este tema técnico de los elementos que están o de los acuerdos que se están tomando sobre este tema. Hasta el momento en lo marino no se han acogido ninguna de las consideraciones de sociedad civil. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? En que todavía no hemos logrado incidir desde lo marino en algunas de las principales consideraciones que se ha hecho desde los órganos o los sectores como el grupo de mujeres que consideran los temas de derechos humanos. Por ejemplo, no tenemos una visión integral ni de derechos humanos. Es decir, mucho se ha visto por parte de las partes su énfasis hacia una economía azul. Es decir, de los elementos sociales, ambientales y económicos, toman uno, el económico, y ese es el camino por el cual se definen todos estos otros elementos de monitoreo, de financiamiento, de inclusión y participación que se ven. Hay un interés mayormente empresarial y neoliberal en este abordaje, que hace entonces que la economía azul, la acuicultura, como en algún momento lo mencionaba Simón, sean los elementos donde vamos a medir el éxito. Eso nos presenta o nos confronta con un enorme reto, que es cómo elevar desde nuestra voz y la voz de los sectores afectados, ¿verdad? Otros elementos de importancia del mar y de sus recursos, ¿verdad? Que no tienen que ver necesariamente con los temas económicos, sino que tienen que ver también con una forma de vida y con la calidad de vida que las comunidades requieren para poder desarrollar un aprovechamiento sostenible. Tampoco hay un enfoque de género a lo largo de los textos que se están negociando en este momento en los dos temas, ni en EPSAS ni en el de marino costero. Y si se menciona, no es un tema transversal y no aborda la diversidad de mujeres pescadoras y molusqueras, que ha sido una de nuestras enormes discusiones, incluso a lo interno del grupo de mujeres, de que debemos de tratar de garantizar que en las discusiones donde se toman en cuenta los temas marinos, tengamos a aquellas personas que están directamente afectadas con las decisiones que tomamos, es decir, mujeres pescadoras y molusqueras, a las que de paso los gobiernos, las partes y muchas veces nosotras mismas como organizaciones no gubernamentales no valoramos ese aporte que dan desde su trabajo y su relación con el océano. Los pueblos indígenas, las comunidades locales, las mujeres pescadoras y molusqueras están muy preocupados por sus derechos cuando se habla de EPSAS, por sus derechos cuando se habla también de los recursos costero marinos y también cuando se habla de aquellos recursos de los ríos que son muy importantes. ¿Por qué hay un interés particular en lo marino? Bueno, porque hay un interés muy grande para hacer explotación de gas, explotación petrolera, turismo masivo, y hemos tenido poco, digamos, respaldo para poder garantizar estos derechos. Desde los pueblos indígenas, las comunidades locales y los pescadores artesanales, hay muchos avances. Muchos avances, ¿por qué? Porque tenemos ahora un documento que vamos a colocar ahorita en el chat de las directrices voluntarias para la sostenibilidad de la pesca artesanal de pequeña escala en el contexto de la seguridad alimentaria y los derechos humanos. Ese documento fue aprobado por los países en el 2014. ¿Qué es lo interesante aquí? Que tenemos nuevos documentos que olvidan esos principios y esos derechos que han sido ya abordados previamente. Entonces, ese documento que lo aprueban en el Comité de Pesca de la FAO, sigue siendo un documento que contiene lo que necesitaríamos tener para la defensa de los derechos humanos cuando hablamos del mar. Pero ese tema no ha sido considerado por las partes y está muy separado, digamos, de las discusiones del CDB. Los pescadores artesanales del mundo se han movilizado ahora en la reunión de los océanos en Lisboa y en la FAO recientemente en Roma para hacernos un llamado a la acción. Un llamado a la acción que vamos a colocar también en el chat para que todas lo puedan revisar si así lo desean, donde se presentan 5 elementos fundamentales para poder garantizar una conservación marino-costera con derechos humanos. Y una de ellas tiene que ver con fortalecer la innovación que plantean las mujeres pescadoras y molusqueras frente al uso de los recursos del mar. Entonces, lo más importante es que ese marco global de biodiversidad tenga un absoluto respeto a la forma de vida holística de los pueblos que viven en nuestras costas, islas, humedales y mares. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Bueno, el que todas las luchas que hagamos desde nuestro sector para defender los derechos humanos en el marco global de biodiversidad, todos los esfuerzos que hagamos para garantizar el libre, previo, informado consentimiento de las partes y el que garanticemos una diversidad de mujeres participantes en la toma de decisiones, incluidas las mujeres pescadoras, cuando se habla del mar, van a ser fundamentales. La discusión sobre otras formas de conservación basadas en áreas, las OSMs o las EPSAs, requieren fuertemente el reconocimiento al conocimiento tradicional y entonces requieren de indicadores sociales y culturales que en este momento no tienen. Es decir, que todos estos elementos fundamentales que estamos tratando de incluir deben de verse reflejados en esos indicadores que ahora nos mostraba Catherine muy claramente para poder garantizar que tengamos esos derechos asegurados. Voy a poner un ejemplo muy claro. En Costa Rica, las mujeres molusqueras y pescadoras no tienen un derecho de acceso al mar. Es decir, solamente los hombres, y muy pocos hombres también, 8 de cada 10, tienen ese reconocimiento. Al crear un área protegida, el derecho consuetudinario para aprovechar los bivalvos, los moluscos, los pierden las mujeres. Entonces, al no tener ese acceso, inmediatamente son las personas que se les impide el aprovechamiento sostenible de los recursos como tradicionalmente se hacía. Entonces, este reconocimiento tiene que hacer cambios estructurales en cada uno de los países. Por eso es que es muy importante el que negociemos esto a un nivel global para luego poder irlo bajando a los niveles locales. Y el tercer elemento que es muy importante es la negociación del 30-30, que es parte de las dos anteriores, y donde debemos ser total y absolutamente responsables de negociar no solamente el consentimiento libre, previo e informado, sino el total reconocimiento de las formas de gobernanza de pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales. En el chat vamos a poner 2 videos que ojalá puedan observar, son muy cortitos, no pasan los 6 minutos de cada uno. Uno es del territorio marino de vida del pueblo Novebuglé en Panamá, donde ellos han utilizado tradicionalmente para la pesca de langosta una isla que se llama la isla de Veraguas, y ahora el gobierno panameño intenta hacer una protección de este lugar maravilloso, pero donde ellos están luchando por mantener su derecho al aprovechamiento sostenible de los recursos y de su territorio. Y el segundo video es el caso de Costa Rica, donde las comunidades afrodescendientes, pescadoras y digamos, afrodescendientes del país, luchan porque se les mantenga su modelo de gobernanza compartida en un parque nacional marino. Y ambos ejemplos son la realidad. Yo creo que tenemos que salir a luchar con esta visión de que solamente trayendo las voces de los verdaderos actores y derechohabientes a los foros internacionales vamos a lograr presentar los casos reales que están sucediendo en nuestros países, porque cuando las partes hablan o los países hablan, solo se presentan las grandes maravillas y no las necesidades de un cambio real de modelo de desarrollo, que es lo que Simón claramente mencionaba y creo que es la lucha que tenemos que hacer. Ahora, hay un debate importante entre pesca artesanal de pequeña escala y pesca tradicional. El punto aquí es que ninguna de las dos ha sido parte del debate, que tiene que ver a sus territorios y formas de vida. Entonces, perfectamente podríamos dividir las fuerzas en este momento entre qué es lo que hablamos de comunidades locales y qué hablamos de pueblos indígenas. Y esa es una discusión a la que nos vamos a enfrentar claramente en la COP de Montreal. En el caso de los temas marinos, hemos estado luchando más bien por unir el debate. ¿Por qué? Porque en realidad no importa si estamos hablando de pesquerías tradicionales indígenas o de pesquerías artesanales de pequeña escala, ambas van a quedar totalmente fuera si no logramos vencer esta lucha por garantizar los derechos humanos de estas comunidades. Y en ese caso, ambos elementos, las directrices voluntarias para la sostenibilidad de la pesca artesanal de pequeña escala, que dice lo que hay que hacer, es decir, los gobiernos ya aprobaron ese documento, lo que pasa es que es voluntario, pero ya está ahí esa visión de derechos humanos, debe de ser recobrada y más actual el llamado a la acción en la Conferencia de los Océanos en Lisboa, donde los pescadores y pescadoras artesanales, ambos indígenas y de comunidades locales, solicitan un 100% de manejo compartido de las pesquerías de pequeña escala. Esto es un elemento muy importante porque garantizaría los derechos de estas comunidades para poder hacer un uso sostenible de sus recursos en el futuro. Solicitan la participación de la mujer y el reconocimiento del papel fundamental de las mujeres en las cadenas de valor de las pesquerías, que ha quedado por lo visto olvidado del debate de la CDB. La defensa de la pesca de pequeña escala frente a las industrias de la economía azul. Vean que esto es muy importante, porque no podemos seguir hablando de pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales costero-marinas si estamos promoviendo, como lo están haciendo en este momento las partes, un turismo masivo, una extracción de gas, una extracción de petróleo, una contaminación por industrias acuícolas que están poniendo en riesgo estas pequeñas pesquerías. Entonces, este es un eje muy importante. Y un eje importantísimo también de la discusión es el tema de la juventud en la pesca. Es ese recambio que tenemos que dar cuando vemos una pesquería no como una actividad exclusivamente económica, sino como una forma de vida vinculada, unida y garantizada con la conservación del ambiente. Y la mujer en la pesca, bueno, sigue siendo ese nuestro reto. En el caso de Costa Rica hemos tratado de avanzar en una agenda de mujeres pescadoras de mares, ríos, costas y humedales. Este es un elemento que nos falta muchísimo todavía discutir en la Convención de Diversidad Biológica. El mar se ve como un asset económico, pero no lo vemos todavía como una fuente de alegría, de fortalecimiento, de resiliencia para las comunidades locales. Y este es el elemento que tenemos que garantizar en esta COP15. Yo quisiera comentarles que estamos en una lucha muy grande por tratar de llevar mujeres pescadoras a la COP, que puedan hablar, que puedan decir lo que significa para ellas el mar, lo que significan los recursos de pesca, y para garantizar que tengamos esas voces también a la par de otros sectores que tienen que estar en la defensa de estos derechos. El tema parece muy complejo. Nos lo están haciendo parecer cada vez más complejo, pero yo espero que esta presentación y el espacio que tengamos ahora para discusión nos permita acercarnos a estos temas. Todas y todos somos expertos en lo que está ocurriendo en nuestros territorios y esas voces tienen que llegar hoy más que nunca a la COP en Montreal. Debemos de decir la verdad. Debemos de decir lo que está pasando en los territorios para evidenciar que sin ese modelo y sin ese cambio de modelo de desarrollo no va a ser posible la sostenibilidad de los recursos marino-costeros ni de otros recursos que tenemos en el planeta. Yo estoy totalmente abierta a cualquier consulta y agradezco muchísimo el espacio para poder compartir hoy. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Vivian, for this presentation. We have learned a lot. And thank you also for making the link with the previous speakers, because as you are showing, all of these topics are interrelated, and the advocacy processes that we are facing should be also like in a holistic, should be holistic. And now we're moving with the last speaker, with Cristina Eigender from WWF, and she will speak to us about the post-2020 gender plan of action. Thank you, Cristina, and welcome. You are muted in case you are speaking.
Yes, sorry. Thank you, and again, wonderful presentation before me, so that is very humbling. And also, yeah, it's always good to listen and learn every time on these complex issues. But I have another consideration about the Gender Plan of Action, which is a fundamentally important document in the context of CBD, but yet it's voluntary in in terms of its implementation, and that remains the biggest obstacle in the process. But anyway, just wanted to use this nice pictures of flower diplomacy of the Women for Biodiversity in Nairobi. I'm sure this is not having spent a lot of money on flowers, but it's probably an investment in the future for women empowerment, right? Okay, so very few points that I would like to share, because I think more can be discussed later, and by looking also at the specific document that we are talking about. This is part of, in the context of SBI. So it's not part of the GBF or the open-ended working group. It's a different process. Like what Vivienne was talking about, I think is also part of SABSTA. It's an item in SABSTA on the coastal, marine and coastal resources, if not mistaken. But anyway, what I'm saying, this is a very complex process, and all of this needs to come together and be finalized and approved by consensus at the COP15 in December. So this will be the document that will be approved. I'm pretty sure, and we are all very confident that it will be approved, for no other reason that there is absolutely no opposition, I would say, to the fact that we need a gender plan of action. The gender plan of action need to be mainstreamed in the implementation of the GBF. No party would object to that. No sensible person would also raise any objections to that. But again, it's all about how it's going to be implemented. This is the only second gender plan of action, right? The first one was 2015 to 2020, and it was reviewed. And what reviewed indicated that, yes, there is need to do more work, that very few parties implemented or even reported on what they did around implementing the gender plan of action. And something that surprised me very much is also how limited the outreach at national level was towards women organizations, women gender experts, and so on. So they were not really involved in the process. I think Catherine, in the context of monitoring, talked a lot about that, but also Vivienne and Simone in different contexts. So we still have a huge deficit in terms of women participation and being at the negotiation table. So briefly, we had the consultation process. I say 21, 22, it was long before that too, but 21, it was when some of the most meaningful consultation, I remember the last one in August, that were held. And that, again, might be a sort of a personal anecdote, but I thought it revealed how strongly representatives of parties attending this consultation on the gender plan of action feel about this, and what strong language they use and propose. Then when you are in the negotiation forum of COP or SBI or whatever, things change a little bit, right? Become political. Those voices are not heard very much. And imagine in terms of the European Union, for example, European Union for SBI issues. Oh, beautiful cat. I think it's a cat. Yeah, okay. It's, they talk with one voice, right? So we don't necessarily hear the specific member states, what they have to say. And they usually have to say a lot on gender issues. I remember during the Friends of Gender Equality meeting in Geneva, Canada, one of the co-conveners with Malawi, talking about the importance of mainstreaming and implementing gender plan of action, the importance for the gender plan of action to be actionable, right? That can be implemented. That's basically what it means. Yes, but there's still a question mark on political will on doing so. Plus, it still falls short of things like specific reference to monitoring, reviewing, and reporting. So it's talking basically about implementation. It talks about modalities. Sorry, I should have put in red principles, because now the language is modalities, and the language that Women for Biodiversity has been advocated for was also using principles. But modality is the one. But it's very interesting whether they chose modalities over principle, that's okay too. But what is the content of it? What do they propose as modalities? And that, I think, this document becomes very courageous and very strong language. So it talks about applying a human rights-based approach, which is nowhere else in documents of the draft GBF, for example, because it's only in the theory of change at the moment, and it talks about right-based approach, not human right. It talks about intersectionality and taking an intersectional approach. It talks about women, environmental and human rights defenders. It talks about land rights. Well, we'll see later that it's still in brackets, but all these issues are brought up. And there is also consideration and provisions on the actual text of the document, of the recommendation to COP. About the important role of women in defending, conserving, sustainably use biodiversity. There's also consideration, specific and special consideration of indigenous and local women. So it's all very good in terms of the proposed text, but again, if this remains voluntary, how can we, what can be done in terms of influencing, encouraging, urging parties to actually implement such a plan? I put there that we can discuss later, because this becomes very intertwined in terms of our advocacy. So there is a gender plan of action. Why do we need a target 22, right? I won't answer this question, but this question is raised so many times still, including by parties that in Nairobi, at least 50 of them finally agreed after the, how many? Around 30 in Geneva, agreed to having a separate gender equality standalone target 22. So do we need a gender plan of action if we have a target 22? Do we need target 22 if we have a gender plan of action? I think all of you can answer this question, but I just flag it as still an issue in the sense of convincing the remaining parties of what needs to be done. Okay, so when we go into the actual document, not the recommendation, it talks about there are 3 expected outcomes that cover. One is about equal opportunity and capacity for all genders to contribute to the 3 objectives of the CBD. The second is about biodiversity policy planning and programming decisions need to address equally the perspective, interests, needs, and human rights of all genders. And the third one is what are the enabling conditions created to ensure gender responsive GBF. So what we have now, so it talks about has outcomes, objectives, indicative action that can be taken to possible deliverable timelines by 2030. By the way, I don't know whether to be honest, so help me, if this gender plan of action is going to be a 5-year cycle or is going to be extended to 2030. It would be interesting because we already wasted 2 years. So I don't know how they're going to do it. So if you can help me with that piece of information. But anyway, there are no indicators there. So back to Catherine to advise on this one. So the yellow highlights is basically, it is a relatively clean document, right, at this moment. So, and has a huge support. And we'll go straight to COP as it is, and I don't expect that it will not be supported. But there are a few things that remain in brackets and could not be cleaned during relatively long sessions of Friends of the Chair, at least a couple of times, plus a contact group in Geneva. And long nights for Amelia and friends. So we still have the right to a healthy environment in the body of the decision text in brackets. But I think there will be no issue if, I mean, we hope that the UN General Assembly approval of the right to a healthy environment will change the mood also in the COP15. And says, so those brackets hopefully will be lifted. There is still the issue of all genders, and also alternatively women and girls in all their diversity. There was some opposition, if I remember correctly, by a couple of parties, actually mostly one. Yeah, reflecting a very conservative culture, if I may, or politics. But we'll see. More importantly, the rights to ownership and control over land and natural resources and access to water. As you might know, one of the current alternatives for Target 22 language, the one proposed by Costa Rica, is actually deprived of rights, the text of the target as it is. But here in the gender plan of action, there is explicit language introduced, but was challenged by other very vocally UK during the Friends of the Chair discussion. We'll see. And last one around human rights, we're still going back and forth on this language because, as I said, it's a very new language talking about human rights within the context of CBDs. And then about specific measure to respect. Currently, I need help on this one. I don't understand what was why you're still in brackets and what was the big issue. Why, who was opposed to lifting the brackets on this one. I only flag also, however, that this talks about knowledge of women, the specific knowledge of women, knowledge, innovation, and practice of women and girls. And this is extremely important. This is totally missing in the GBF, including in Target 20, where it makes a reference to traditional knowledge, but there is no specific explicit reference to gender aspects of it. I think that's all I have. I was very poor. Did I? Aha, there. Oh, it's gone. I don't know where it went. But one thing, one little win during the discussion in Geneva was that when we were trying to clean up the text from brackets, there was in that group a consensus on using urge parties to implement. And that is one of the strongest language you can use in negotiation, actually. So it wasn't request and it wasn't encourage. It wasn't even invite. So it's urging. Hopefully it's still there, and that make a difference in terms of making this a reality. I'll stop here, Amelia. Sorry for all shortcomings.
Everything was perfect. Thank you so much, Cristina. You raised also many points to be discussed, no? And as you're saying, like the advocacy strategy should be strengthened, so we retain all of these winnings, which are not little. Like I think that is really like the result of all of the years that all of you have invested and others, no, in this process. And now I will